Thank you, Dr. Cottle. It's good to see everyone again this year, and I'm glad that, like Apostle Kelly said, that everybody here has been able to get here and be a part of the conference. I'm going to have a PowerPoint. If you can get that ready for me, that would be wonderful. Last year, actually in 2019, I began to work on something really out of my own curiosity, and that was to look at movements across the spectrum of society. And when I began to study these movements, I decided that I was going to try to make this as extra biblical as possible, meaning that I was going to try to stay away from using biblical language and just using the Bible as the only source and the foundation of what I was wanting to study. And so I began to look at various movements throughout history in the various spectrums of society. For instance, I did a lot of study on the Bolshevik Revolution, which was the Russian Marxist Revolution. I just thought that was fascinating. And then I began to look at other Marxist revolutions in China, in Cambodia, in Central America, because there was something there, and this started back about 2017, there was something there that I felt like I needed to wrap my brain around. Then I began to look at other types of movements, which included religious movements. In the United States, we've had what was called the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And I wanted to try to see if there were common elements across that spectrum. I looked at the temperance movement, for instance, in the beginning of the 20th century, which added an amendment to the United States Constitution that banned alcohol and the sale of alcohol across the country. I mean, that was a major, whether or not, the results of that is what they wanted, it was still a major movement. The women's suffrage movement that gave women the right to vote in the United States. And the reason I was doing this is because of a lot of conversation that Apostle Kelly and I were having about ICAL being a movement. And so I really wanted to try to wrap my brain around exactly what is a movement and where does a movement start. And so as I began to formulate and read and do my research and just read these various books and try to work through my mind what was a common thread between all of these different movements, whether they're religious movements, political movements, social movements like the American Civil Rights Movement, for instance, like what was the common thread across the spectrum of all these movements. And that's where this document came from that you have in front of you. And I'm not going to read the document, but I'm going to just basically go through this graphic on the screen. One of the questions even before we begin that I think is an important question is, can you manufacture a movement? And if you can, is it ethical? And that's an important question. And I think that if we try to manufacture a movement that isn't happening, then it actually hurts our cause. Because we're trying to convince everyone that something's happening when in fact it's not. But yet I do believe that structure is important. Like when I read the Bible in Acts chapter 2, we know that Acts chapter 2, what happened there, the Holy Spirit was poured out. But Acts chapter 1 precedes Acts chapter 2. And I don't hold the opinion that the apostles of the Lamb were out of the will of God whenever they did what they did by putting Matthias in the place of Judas. I don't adhere to that. Luke wrote that document 30 years afterwards. I don't think he would have included that had it been the wrong move. And so what does that mean? It means that there was some structure before the outpouring. And so the way that I kind of see movements happening is that there seems to be a wind blowing somewhere, and if we can create the sails to get up in that wind, that current is going to take us somewhere. But you still have to have that structure. You know what I'm saying? We just can't say, well, God's going to pour out His Spirit, and then we do nothing about it. It seemed the apostles did something about it. And when they created that structure in Acts chapter 1, it's certainly true that those structures have to be modified as time goes on. And those structures have to grow. And we know this because Jesus talked about the wineskin. And we know that wineskins have to be modified and adjusted. And sometimes what holds us back is not the wind. It's that we have not structured for the next level. And so those structures have to be rethought and examined constantly, by the way, constantly. If you're existing on the same structures in your church or your ministry that you were using in the 1990s, it's old. And what's tragic is we don't even know it at times. And so When I looked at movements, it was like, okay, did the movement start and people respond, or did people create an environment in which that movement was able to take them forward? And I think that while simultaneously both are true, I do believe that there are things that we can do, especially in ICAL, and if you're responsible for perhaps an apostolic coalition in a city, or if you're responsible for an apostolic coalition in a nation. And I think that if we want to transition from organization into movement, there are some things that are common across the spectrum of all the movements that I studied. So this is where I'm at today. It's not like I think that this is it, the finished product. There is no finished product. It's just an ongoing examination.